Let's talk about family systems theory in House of the Dragon. Now, when I was learning about this, it was referred to as family dynamics theory, so I might slip up and use that terminology, but it's basically the same thing. Just wanted to get that out there. So to start, little disclaimer, I am not a therapist or a psychologist. However, my degree is in psychology and social science, and I did work for a while in mental health alongside therapists, so that's kind of what I'm basing this off of. Two, I'm not trying to diagnose anyone. Also, these are characters and not real people. I think the writers are aware of these kind of family dynamics and are using these roles almost as tropes to kind of shape the characters and the writing and where the story is going. This will be largely based on the show also, just because the show and the book canon are, pretty different at this point. Towards the end, when we are talking about some speculation for the future, I will kind of mention the books a little bit, just because I feel like they might give us a little bit of insight as to where the show's going, but it's really up to the show to decide how faithfully they're going to adapt the story. So I do not own any of these photos or video clips. They are all owned by HBO. And then lastly, why is this topic important? Like I said, I think it's important because it gives us better, well-rounded insight into the characters and how they operate. And with knowing this, it can kind of give us some, better guesstimates as to where their stories may be going in the future. So with that, let's get into it. So Viserys as the narcissistic parent. We can't discuss Viserys being the kind of narcissistic parent or in the narcissistic parent role without addressing the elephant in the room, which is the inherent narcissism of his position, of being the, sole ruler on the Iron Throne, and also being from the most important, genetically superior dragon family. And now, whether or not you agree or disagree that the Targaryens are blood supremacists, like more important, that is a moot opinion. What is important is in-world people believe this, and Viserys himself believes this, and his family believes this. They believe they're the most important family. And so being the patriarch of the most important family and also being told that you are the most important person in the realm inherently kind of forces you into a narcissistic role. With this in mind, though, this does not really excuse, nor does it kind of become the sole blame for his behavior within his own family and within the family system. So how he behaves behind closed doors, basically. Yes, it's true he has to project a certain image in public, and he has a great weight to bear, and that pressure could be kind of the cause of why he acts a certain way in public, but it doesn't mean he needs to act that way in private. And I don't think he believes this, though, as we see from his discussions with Rhaenyra about, even he is not above, traditions and duty and the law. I think he thinks he needs to wear this kingly role all the time, even in private with his family, and that's where we kind of get some issues. And we know he doesn't need to do this because we do see other kings of Westeros, we see other patriarchs, like, say, Ned Stark, and we see how they operate within their family systems, and it's not like this into this level. So it is interesting to kind of think and try to parse how much of this kind of narcissistic role is due to the pressures of the throne and Viserys' position, and how much of it is actually just kind of how he is as a person. I think, like I said, in public, that can kind of be chalked up to the pressures of the, presentation he has to present, but in private, that might be a little bit more just how he is as a parent. So with that, what are these kind of narcissistic traits that we see from him? I have a little chart here, signs of a narcissistic parent. These are not all of the signs, these are not all of the things, this is just a few of them. But with this, I personally feel like Viserys exhibits at least 17 out of 22 on this list. You could probably argue more, but for the sake of timing in this video, we're just going to talk about 17 of them, 17 out of 22. So, number one, care about how they appear to others. Again, this could be excused kind of as a symptom of his position, but it is very clear that Viserys cares about his appearance and the appearance of his family. We see this in his discussions with Rhaenyra on marriage, about, tradition, again, not being above the law, etc., and in his desire to appear as a strong king to everyone. When he hears the rumor of Rhaenyra's promiscuity, he works very quickly to correct it, to keep up appearances. You could even argue that him hiding his illnesses and injuries to the extent that he does is, again, to uphold this strong kingly image. And again, that is all kind of expected as the king in public, in the society. But again, in private, he decides to still uphold this image. We see this when he confronts Daemon and he's on the throne about, the brothel scandal. He has positioned himself on the throne with his crown, kind of in the dark with his sword. And it's like, how long have you been waiting there doing that to kind of like intimidate your brother? Like, you don't need to do that. It's just the two of you in private. You could level with each other, but no, he wants to impose this imposing strong appearance on him in order to try to get him to obey and listen to him. So, care about appearance. And in itself, being concerned about appearances does not fully indicate a narcissistic parent. It's just this paired with all the other things on this list paints a picture of someone who could be a narcissistic parent. Number 3 on the list, so love only when it benefits them. We see this with Viserys kind of withholding love and care and consideration for Rhaenyra, for Aemma, and for Daemon, and really kind of only showing the love and care when it kind of serves him. So he's only kind and loving to Rhaenyra when he sees her as his only option for an heir, and then he reaffirms this by staying firm on her claim. But part of the reason he stays firm on his claim is clear that it's because he has a lot of guilt over what he did to Aemma. Him slating Rhaenyra into this golden child role, which to be clear, in the long run is not beneficial for her and actually is detrimental to her and the other children within this family system. He puts her in this role and he largely ignores his other children in favor of her to kind of uphold her claim in order to help him slake his guilt over what he did to Aemma, who he now views as his one true love. Him upholding her claim could be for multiple reasons. Like I said, maybe, he does, in a way, love her, but also it is seemingly to kind of fix some of the guilt that he has. Speaking of his one true love, Aemma, he showed her love kind of as a means to an end because he wanted a male heir. He may have loved her, I'm sure he did. He kind of only realized this after she was gone, and he loved her really for what he benefited to gain from her, a male heir. And we see this because ultimately he is willing to sacrifice her and her love and his love for her to get what he wants, the means to an end, the heir. Next would be number 4, putting their needs and wants first. This could be seen in him marrying Alicent Hightower as opposed to making a choice that would be better for politics and for the realm in general, like marrying Laena Velaryon. And again, sacrificing his wife against her wishes, something she did not want to do so that he could have a son. That's putting his wants and needs first. He's 6 on the list, claiming to care about Rhaenyra's feelings, but seemingly going against them. He says to her face, he says, I care about you, I want you to be happy, in terms of her choosing a love match for her marriage, but then kind of turns around and says, you're not picking a love match soon enough, just kidding, I'm gonna assign to you who you're gonna marry, I'm gonna tell you what to do. Forcing her to get married, courting Alicent, even though he knows Rhaenyra would not approve and it will damage their relationship. That's not very caring and considering for Rhaenyra. It's not very caring or considering for Alicent, her position. Claiming to care for Daemon, yet not listening to what he wants. He very much levels with Viserys, and we'll get into this with Daemon, this kind of truth teller aspect of being the scapegoat. He kind of tells him how it is, and Viserys does not want to hear it. Not paying attention to Alicent's wants or needs over his own sexual desire. We see this pretty clearly. She pretty unenthusiastically is going along with what he wants. He's waking her up late in the night when she doesn't really want to be there, but she's being the dutiful wife. And he even goes as far as to embarrass her publicly to make himself look better. He doesn't really care about her feelings or perceptions. He kind of makes a joke at her expense when she's doing everything right. She's trying to be the courteous, perfect wife that she's been raised to be, and he still finds a way to make her the butt of the joke in order to make him look like the cool, goofy, funny guy. It's just not great. Number 8, not treating you like your own person. Again, we see this with Alicent and Rhaenyra. We never really see him taking an interest in Alicent, her wants, her needs, what she likes. Same with Rhaenyra. He kind of treats her in a way, and it's key to kind of explain. Narcissistic parents do love their children in a way, but often they love them as an extension of themselves, as their legacy. And we see him directly say this to her. There are multiple instances where he reminds her, you are my legacy. Like when she goes out riding on the dragon to get the dragon egg from Daemon, he isn't like immediately concerned of, you're my daughter, I didn't want you to get hurt, blah, blah. He says, you are my legacy, you are my only heir. So it's that reminder of like, you are this thing for me that I need, as opposed to, I didn't want you to get hurt, XYZ, etc. It's just, it's the language is important. And so next, number 9, make you feel guilty about what they do for you. We see this in his conversation with Daemon about the positions he has granted Daemon, that Daemon says he did not want. Really, we know that these positions were kind of just to placate Daemon and keep him away. Daemon knows that too, but Viserys does not want to admit that. Rhaenyra and Viserys' hunting conversation, he tells her, I want you to be happy, but then you're not doing it fast enough. He's making her feel guilty about what he says he is doing for her. He kind of gives her this bare communication. She is very clearly expressing to him that she is anxious and nervous about being replaced as his heir. People are talking, people are saying this. And when he is confronted by this, when he hears other people saying, oh, well, we thought, yeah, that you were going to name Aegon heir, he doesn't then seek out Rhaenyra and be like, hey, I hear you, I see what's going on, I want to let you know, I'm not going to replace his heir. No, he doesn't comfort her in that way. He doesn't really do anything to assuage her fears about marriage, about being replaced. Instead, he kind of berates her and kind of publicly yells at her. We also see him kind of making her feel guilty about what he does for her. He says to her at one point, when she's upset that he kind of was in what she believes is going behind her back to make a match for her. He says, I'm just trying to help you. Will you not be helped? Turning it on her, like it's her fault for being upset. He is not taking any blame. Number 10, accusing you of things that they are. Again, the Rhaenyra marriage conversation. He says, I do not wish to be married. And he says, okay, but not like that. I want you to be happy, but not like that. He kind of broke the rule, broke the tradition. He should have probably married Helena. Instead, he didn't. He followed his desires. He married Alicent. When Rhaenyra wants to follow her desires and not be married, that's not okay. So, accusing you of things they are, accusing you of things that they themselves do. Number 13, don't take responsibility or apologize, instead gets angry. Again, I was trying to help you, will you not be helped, in response to Rhaenyra being upset, flipping it on her, making it her fault. He does this in many other instances as well. Controlling all aspects of your life. Number 14, Rhaenyra and Alicent are good examples of this. He has an easier time of this with Alicent than Rhaenyra, and I think it is because Otto also checks off a lot of these boxes for being a narcissistic parent, so he's used to kind of fitting into this mold. Whereas, Rhaenyra, maybe there are various different reasons, when her mother was alive and kind of was fulfilling this, more enabler caretaker role, Rhaenyra wasn't paid as much attention to. She was the golden child. She didn't have as much of these pressures on her because Viserys thought he was going to have a son all the time. And she also has a dragon, dragon rider. She has other people within her network, like Daemon, her uncle, like people that she relies on in her kind of family unit, whereas Alicent seemingly did not really have anyone else. So again, it kind of primes Alicent for being easier to be controlled than Rhaenyra. So again, controlling aspects of their life. And this is all a good example too of, this control. Even with Alicent, in the ways that he controls her, he's still not happy. And we see this with his outburst at the bonfire. He kind of almost with vitriol is spitting at her of like, I never thought I would be married again, as if that's her fault, when she, to be clear, has just been kind of a pawn in Otto's games, and he chose to marry her. Viserys chose to marry her. It's not really her fault, but still, he is never happy. Number 15, finding ways to hurt you without looking like the bad guy. I feel like we've already given some good examples of this, but another example is, Rhaenyra saying to him directly, "Is that what I am to you, a prize to proffer to the great houses?" And instead of reaffirming to her and saying, "Of course not, Rhaenyra, you're my daughter, I love you," he says, "You're of age, Rhaenyra." Not saying no, not denying that he sees her as this extension of him, this object. So that kind of sucks. Demanding obedience and having unreasonable expectations. He says this a lot. He says, like, you disobeyed me, you directly disobeyed me, you fled King's Landing, you acted without the crown's leave, and stuff like, you will obey, you will do your duty. So again, it's kind of him imposing this kingly role, but he does this in private as well as in public. Playing favorites with the children. This is very obvious. It's very clear Rhaenyra is his favorite. He even directly says, like, Rhaenyra, my only child, at some point. He lacks scenes with his other children, and this is directly, a direct choice by the writers and showrunners to showcase that he does not have a very solid or involved relationship with the other children. He's very focused on Rhaenyra. It's important, though, that when Aegon is first born, he's giving him a lot of attention, because narcissistic parents like a fresh start, because it gives them the ability to live out and chase this idealized version of their lives. So, baby Aegon, but then once the kid kind of grows and starts becoming their own person with their own thoughts and feelings, the narcissist becomes bored and moves on to the next thing. They're never happy. So there's that. Then 19, blaming you for things that aren't your fault. Again, we can go back to that Alicent conversation at the bonfire, him kind of spitting at her almost vitriolically about not believing he would ever be married again. We see this also with conversations with Daemon, conversations with Rhaenyra, and then giving you their responsibilities. We can see this in him expecting Rhaenyra to light Emma's funeral pyre. We also see this in putting his responsibilities on Rhaenyra to have her marriage be the thing to fix the relationship with the Velaryons, when he himself should have done this. We also see him putting a lot of the family responsibilities on Alicent, and we see her, especially later in his life, take on this caretaker role of kind of almost running the kingdom for him, taking on these roles because he's becoming more and more sick, which that is not necessarily his fault, but it's just something to note. And lastly, intimidating or punishing you if you disobey. Again, we see this with Rhaenyra, with Daemon, with Alicent and her kids, etc. Some of these are kind of redundant, but again, I feel like it is important to build up the list of these things to kind of create that profile that is, what makes a narcissistic parent. Again, how much of this is the stress of the position he is in, and how much of it is Viserys, the person himself? Would he be this way if he was not king? We don't really know. All we know is what we do see on screen and how we see him interact in publicly and in privately with his family. So, moving on. Viserys also as the identified patient. So usually the narcissistic parent and the identified patient are not the same thing, but this is TV, so we're kind of mixing up some stuff. So we've established that Viserys kind of exhibits a lot of the traits of a narcissistic parent. He's kind of fulfilling that role as a character, as this, stand-in for the concept of the Iron Throne, of the patriarchy, of the Targaryen family in general. But with that, I feel he also fills the identified patient in the family system. And the identified patient is the member of the family who largely gets blamed for the rest of the family's dysfunction. Oftentimes, this is a person who gets put in like therapy for first or is labeled the problem. Usually it's a child who is kind of fulfilling the scapegoat role who gets blamed for a lot of stuff. But in this case, it is Viserys because he's literally a sick patient and he's being kind of taken care of as he's deteriorating. And a lot of his illnesses can be blamed on the way that he treats his family, especially later in his life. We see, in his case, he is the king. This causes a lot of stress and issues within the family. And then two, he's very sick. So together these things are kind of the main blame for why the family ends up the way it is. And even in a narrative plot way, he is kind of used as the identified patient and the scapegoat to blame majority of the conflict on, In his old age and illness, Viserys mistakenly tells Alicent the wrong thing and kind of tells her Aegon's prophecy thinking that she is Rhaenyra, and that is what causes all the conflict. So therefore kind of making him the scapegoat for all the issues to come. So, identified patient. Next, moving on. So this all kind of slates for Rhaenyra to fit into and tick off a lot of the box markers for being the golden child. From a young age, Rhaenyra is kind of called the realm's delight. Overall, she checks off a lot of these boxes, and these boxes would be being an only child or being the child of a previous marriage. Golden children often work very hard, they're confident, and they are the confidant of their parent, but usually they're just kind of a pawn for the narcissistic parent's own glory and legacy. Again, that word legacy. So they kind of have this compulsive need to be successful, and this pressure can be detrimental. I feel like we see that, especially in season 1 with Rhaenyra, with a lot of these pressures building on her, these expectations, when she just wants to be a kid. This later then manifests as like illness or stress-related injuries, and I feel like in season 2 we see a lot of that. We see her cracking under this stress and pressure that she has had put upon her, her whole life. It's very difficult. Within the family system, the golden child often can do no wrong. Their faults are often brushed off, and they get the best of everything. They kind of serve as this extension for the narcissistic parent, which makes sense with Rhaenyra being in this role of heir. She is, the Targaryen heir, and she's also, the heir to the throne. But with this, you might be thinking, oh, the golden child is the one you want to be, that's the best position. Not necessarily true. None of these positions are really probably better than the others. They all come with their own, pitfalls. And so, like I said, with the golden child, this often manifests as them having a large amount of pressure upon them to be perfect and uphold the family image. We see this in season 1 with her. And then when golden children do not meet these standards, it can be ruthless and explosive for them from the narcissistic parent in private, but then brushed off in public and made to seem like they're perfect. And so to other people, it gives this appearance that the golden child is never in trouble, they never do anything wrong, and they're never an issue, but internally, they're internalizing this stress and pressure and these kind of mixed messages they're receiving from the parent, etc. With this too, golden children can often become obsessively attached with others to kind of boost their own sense of self-worth. And I feel like we see this with the really heavy attachment between Alicent and Rhaenyra in season 1, and then later we see this with Rhaenyra and Daemon. So, moving on from that, the golden child we've established. Rhaenyra is fulfilling that golden child role, the favored child, the child who can do no wrong in the eyes of the narcissistic parent. Next, we have Alicent as the caretaker. So the caretaker is often a parentified child, basically a child who has had to take on the role of a parent or caretaker from a very young age. Often they're given undue responsibility that should be put upon an either absent or lacking parent. In her case, it's an absent parent. Her mother died. We see this in Otto treating her as a confidant and involving her in his schemes in ways a husband would traditionally involve the wife, not the child. And we also see this in the way that she acts very mature for her age. That's another kind of sign of parentification. Again, these things on their own are not explicit determiners of this, but when you add up all these together, it makes that picture. So she is the one to get things done within the family. Sometimes the caretaker is called the doer, and I feel like we see that with her at a young age. She is the doer in Otto's plans. She is the pawn. She is the one that goes out and executes them. So in her marriage to Viserys, she becomes the caretaker. And so the doer, the caretaker, and the enabler, it's all words for the same role, but I feel like those words have different connotations. So at a young age, she's kind of the doer, and then she kind of becomes more of a caretaker for Viserys, even literally becoming a caretaker for him. So even before they're married, she becomes very responsible for his grief and his mourning. She tries to comfort Rhaenyra at times too, even after they're married, and her and Rhaenyra are kind of feuding. Later, she takes on the physical role of a caretaker for Viserys as he kind of deteriorates in his health. She runs the realm for him while he is, very sick. And so she also hides him from public, shielding him from people's judgment to maintain appearances. This is something that the caretaker, the enabler, the doer often will do. They will kind of shield the narcissistic parent from the judgment of others. And yeah, it's important to note that the caretaker and enabler often tries to keep everything in check and according to the status quo. They try to keep the ship running. And in essence, this is how they were able to go so long with no one really knowing how far deteriorated Viserys had become. Even Daemon and Rhaenyra were not fully aware of it until they visited King's Landing, because Alicent was just so good at running that ship. She was so good in that caretaker role that she's been kind of in her whole life. The caretaker is often responsible, conflict avoidant, and sacrificing, self-sacrificing. So usually they're seen as the good parent against the absent or narcissistic parent. So in Alicent's case, I'm not saying she is a good parent, a perfect parent. What I am saying is, compared to Viserys, it seems like she was the parent that was there for the Green children. It is very intentional that the showrunners did not give us really many or any scenes with Viserys bonding with the Green children. That is an intentional choice to showcase what their relationships are like, as opposed to we see Alicent having multiple scenes with these children. They're not always successful. She's not always great at bonding with them, but she's at least trying to do something in some way. She at least is having conversations with them. She's the parent that was there, even if she's not really good at being there. And by default, this makes her the better parent, at least from what we see. The caretaker oftentimes has a subconscious wish for control, and this can lead to them to not harboring agency within their children, instead kind of reinforcing dependency and toxic dynamics. So we kind of see this dependency from Aegon and Alicent in season 2. When they're having a conversation, he's kind of looking to her for guidance, and when asking for it, she's not really giving him any indication on how to be independent. Instead, she kind of tells him to do nothing. She kind of advises him to stay dependent rather than giving him this self-reliance. And because of this, this lack of harboring self-reliance and independence in her children, we may kind of see some future resentment from Aemond, maybe resenting her for seeing him kind of as an equal partner as opposed to helping him grow in the ways that he needed as a child. And we'll kind of get more into that when we talk about Aemond. So it's important to note too that this cycle and these kind of things are bad for the parent as well, because it traps them in this cycle of distress and responsibility. But I feel like this makes a lot of sense for Alicent's character. What we see from that interaction with her and Rhaenys about her, not really wanting to escape her prison, not escape her tower, but instead build a little window in her gilded cage. This makes sense that she's not really trying to disrupt or break these toxic family dynamics and systems that she has been born into. She's just kind of staying with the cycle. And it's interesting and important to note too that the caretaker, if not careful, can fall into the role of the martyr. They can become the martyr, which is excessive self-sacrificing, guilt-tripping people over their sacrificing, being passive-aggressive to others, reminding them of their sacrifices, feeling a lot of resentment, especially for others who they feel like are not adhering to these systems, not following the way that things are, not obeying the orders and the laws and the traditions, and they also need a lot of validation. So I feel like all of those again, fit Alicent very well. So we're gonna do a second little disclaimer in here. People get really mad on Twitter when you bring up certain psychological terms regarding House of the Dragon, specifically Otto and Alicent, Alicent and Aemond, those terms being parentification and emotional incest. I'm not sure why. My only guess is that maybe people are misunderstanding what these terms mean. When I say emotional incest, I'm not meaning actual incest. That's not what that is. There are two different things. There is a lot of actual incest in this show and in these books, but that is not what we're talking about. Emotional incest is a different thing. I will explain what it means. Parentification is, its own thing, and because these characters are exhibiting these things does not mean they're bad people. Again, they're characters, they're not real. It actually makes them more interesting. In real life, it's not really great to have these dynamics going on in your family, but in a fictitious TV show, it makes for entertaining TV, and it actually makes the characters more interesting, well-rounded, and in some ways sympathetic. So with that in mind, We do see some signs of emotional incest between Otto and Alicent, and I have the signs up here for what emotional incest is. I think he exhibits some of these things. For example, relying on the child for emotional support. It's unclear when this started, if it started before his wife died or after. Because they are so comfortable in these roles, I would take a guess and say maybe it started before. And this isn't just like relying on your child when you're sad or something. It's putting an unheavy burden of your emotionality upon the child. It's to a level that is too extreme. Invading their privacy or space, we kind of see this with him, looking at her hands and being like, why do you do this to yourself, etc. Making inappropriate comments about her body, wear your mother's dress, sexualizing her, even though she is his daughter and she's at a very young age. That is inappropriate. Involving them in your personal matters that are not age appropriate. Again, his plot specifically to kind of pimp her out to the king, and forcing her to keep secrets for the parent. And this isn't just like keeping a secret about what they got your sibling for their birthday. This is like heavy, deep emotional secrets that weigh on the child. And I think her having to keep the secret of her secretly courting the king from Rhaenyra and from others is a heavy, weighty, kind of dangerous secret that is inappropriate for her to bear. So all of these things can kind of result in the child feeling responsible for the parent and their feelings. And I feel like we see this in when Otto gets kind of expelled from his role as hand. Alicent feels kind of a heavy level of responsibility for this. And kind of see this in how upset she is and in the fact that she sided with Rhaenyra when, in all honesty, it is not her fault. It is Otto's fault for scheming, yet she is still bearing some of that responsibility for his feelings and what happens to him. We also see this resulting in conflict with siblings. We don't really see this with Alicent. We do, however, see this with Aemond, which we'll talk about in a bit. We see, isolation from others. We see this happen with Alicent. It's also kind of due to her new role as queen, but it can also partially be due to the fact that she is parentified and in this role. We don't really see her have any other friends other than Rhaenyra. Pressures of perfectionism. We definitely see this with Alicent, especially in her body-focused repetitive behaviors, her skin picking, her excessive scrubbing of the skin. These are high-stress perfectionist tendencies that could be, in turn, kind of due to this high pressure role that she's been given. And so with this, the emotional incest that we see between Alicent and Aemond, now it's not as clear, but I think with what the showrunners and the writers have shown us with these characters, it kind of is hinting at and painting this picture a little bit, not as clearly as with Otto and Alicent, but a little bit enough to kind of tell us that these cycles of toxicity and these kind of abusive dynamics have not healed with this new generation. They've kind of only continued. And so with Alicent Aemond, we see her relying on the child for emotional support. In the scene where he loses his eye, he, comforts her, he tells her mother it's okay, where she's kind of inconsolable and very upset. This should not be on the role of the child to do this. That kind of goes without saying. Lying to protect the parent. He lies about where he heard the rumor about the Strong Boys being bastards, and then he blames it on Aegon. Again, kind of slating Aegon into this scapegoat role. We'll get more into that when we talk about Aegon. So again, that kind of keeping secrets and lying for the parent aspect. Invading privacy, space, and boundaries. We don't necessarily see this too much with Aemond. I mean, we see her holding him very lovingly and trying to, convince him to do things for her. And on its own, that is not a toxic thing to do. That's a very normal thing for parents to do. But again, when you kind of tally it up with all these other things, it paints a different picture. We do see her, however, invading the privacy and space of Aegon when he's younger, kind of bursting into the room when he's naked, not caring about his privacy, and then involving them in personal matters. We see this quite a bit with Aemond in his treatment in season 2. She relies on him in a way that typically a mother would rely on their partner, on the father, as opposed to the child. And it's because of the absence of the parent at this point, Viserys. It's clear that she prefers Aemond. I'm not going to say he's her favorite child, but he is the preferred child. And this is likely because of their shared role within the family. Alicent is kind of slated as this caretaker, the doer, and I think Aemond is kind of inhabiting that similar role for the next generation in his family. And because of this, it kind of gives them these shared values and responsibilities and bonds them in that way. In Aemond's case, too, we kind of see this manifest in him seeking out older partners that can kind of mother him and don't rely on him in these ways that Alicent relies on him, to kind of pick up the emotional slack of the family, per se. We see this in the brothel scene. It's clear that they have a sexual relationship going on with, him and this brothel worker that he kind of exclusively has been seeing, but it's also notable that we see her engaging with him in non-sexual kind of caressing touch. She's caressing his hair, in a very loving way. So it kind of is painting this picture that he is seeking out this comfort from almost an older, almost parent-like figure outside of the roles and responsibilities that he's been given from a young age. Oh, next. Aegon as the scapegoat or the clown. So the scapegoat is often blamed for the family's issues, often unfairly. Aegon is the firstborn son, and thus he is the crux of all of Rhaenyra's issues regarding her claim. He is Viserys' headache because he's constantly getting asked by people, when is he gonna, be the heir? When are you gonna marry him to Rhaenyra, etc. Like, it's causing all these problems. He is Alicent's reminder of her unhappy marriage and her duties, and he's in Aemond's way. He's just not a good husband to Helena, so he is the problem in the family. However, even before he inhabited these roles of, being not a very good husband, he was never really given a fair chance. And we see Alicent blame him and get angry at him for not complying to the systems, for causing disruptions, even though at his younger age, a lot of these disruptions could be kind of chalked up to somewhat typical behavior for adolescents, like underage drinking, engaging in some bullying behaviors. Like, none of these things make an evil person or are egregious. To her, she is very angry at him for any of these kind of lapses in what she thinks is okay. He is kind of living in the shadow of Rhaenyra as the golden child, and he has this immense pressure on him from his mother, all whilst his mother is holding him to this unfair level of misplaced contempt. It's clear that she does not like him, and this could be because she cannot get angry at her husband, she cannot lash out at him, so instead she lashes out at the next thing, her firstborn son, that reminds her of her husband. In a way, Aegon is kind of the symbol to her of her chains, of her duty. Scapegoats are often chosen based on the traits that remind people of the previous scapegoat. Remember how we said Viserys is inhabiting this role of a narcissistic parent, but he's also inhabiting the role of the identified patient, of the previous scapegoat that we're blaming all of the family issues on. So Aegon is chosen as the scapegoat because of his kind of similarities and proximity to Viserys. We see this almost directly too in season 2 when he gets injured and thus has to be taken care of in very similar ways to Viserys. And with this, the scapegoat can do no right, and their accomplishments are often dismissed. And we see this with Aegon with his conversations in season 2 with Otto, with Alicent. No matter what he does, even if he's trying to do good, they kind of just meet him with, "You're an idiot." Oftentimes, the scapegoat in a family is the one that kind of breaks out of the toxic system and goes and gets therapy and help and becomes the more healthy person, and that's kind of why they're ostracized from the toxic dynamic. But sometimes they don't do that, they don't get help, and instead they double down on this scapegoat role they've been given and they become a rebel scapegoat. And I feel like that's what we see from Aegon. He's been told for so long that he's bad and everything he does is bad, so he doubles down on it and does act bad. He does things, he acts out, and he kind of gets into this self-fulfilling prophecy role. That we also see that scapegoats often have difficulties with forming family relationships, healthy relationships with healthy boundaries, and they have difficulties with self-worth. I feel like we definitely see that with Aegon, with his relationship with Alicent, with Aemond, and with Helena. We see, though, that Aegon does want love and acceptance. We see with that scene with him and Larys, he says, "Aegon, the realm's delight." He wants to be the golden child. He wants to just be loved and accepted. We also see this in season 1 with him at the coronation. He doesn't want to be there, doesn't want to be doing it, but then when he gets the cheers and the love from the crowd, he's happy. Another thing to note too is that sometimes the scapegoat will kind of develop a sense of humor, and this is kind of where the clown comes in. I don't think necessarily Aegon is fully inhabiting the systemic role of the clown in his family, but I do think he has had to develop a sense of humor in order to cope with his role and his lot in life as a coping mechanism. So the clown is the member of the family that tries to diffuse the anger and tension in the family by distracting and making jokes. And we see Aegon making jokes, mostly in season 2, oftentimes going too far with them. So again, that goes into the issue with boundaries. But his humor is used to kind of endear the audience to him more, and give us this view of him in a more sympathetic light. And it kind of distracts from his own bad actions, as well as it kind of showcases some more of the dysfunction within his family. Often develop a sense of humor as a coping mechanism, but sometimes their expressions can be inappropriate and uncomfortable. I feel like we see this with Aegon going too far in the brothel with Aemond, etc. In other cases, it can kind of become antagonistic. So we see this with like Otto and with his mom, also when he's trying to like crack jokes in tense situations and they're not having it. So next, Daemon. The black sheep, it's another word for the scapegoat. I think Daemon and Aegon inhabit similar roles within their families. So Daemon is inhabiting this role of, the scapegoat, the black sheep. And so this role as the scapegoat can be seen as a distraction from the family's real problems. And we see this being used as a literal plot device in season 1, with Daemon being this kind of pseudo-antagonist to distract from the real issues, being the succession, the discourse throughout the realm, Aegon's prophecy, etc. Instead, we kind of focus largely on Daemon's discourse in the family. Daemon inhabits his scapegoat title by, like Aegon, becoming a rebel scapegoat. He doubles down on what people believe him to be, and he doubles down on what people say he is. And we see this with stealing a dragon egg, him going to war in the Stepstones, and then getting very mad when he's not getting the reaction he wants from Viserys, coming back and giving his crown to Viserys, and then his consistent small conflicts with his children, with Rhaenyra, etc. This inappropriate expression of feelings is very common for the scapegoat, and it's all because this is how he thinks he can get attention and love. It's all he really knows and understands. So with this too, scapegoats can often be truth tellers, but this is not always an accepted thing. And I feel like we see this pretty directly with him leveling with Viserys and telling him the truth about how Otto is, about what Daemon wants. He wants to be by Viserys' side, and that is not accepted. That is not heard by Viserys, and that can be very painful and damaging for the scapegoat. He is pretty defiant in his behavior due to these feelings of powerlessness. We also see that scapegoats are usually highly emotionally sensitive, and I feel like we do see that from Daemon. We see in season 2, when he is confronted with emotional moments, him lashing out, sometimes in physical ways like slapping away a cup. Sometimes we see this in him fleeing at the dysfunction of the family, being very sensitive to the conflict and dysfunction from within the own family due to this kind of fear of rejection. We also see these kind of internalized feelings of shame, self-worth issues, blame, and burden from the scapegoat, which I feel like we do see quite a bit from Daemon in season 2, when he's kind of working through a lot of his traumas at Harrenhal. He has a lot of self-blame for the things that he's done. He has a lot of shame and a lot of self-worth issues in regards to how he acts and his family, etc. And it makes sense, knowing all these things, that him and Rhaenyra would become somewhat intertwined and get along well, because, she has this heavy pressure on her as heir, as the golden child. He really wants love and acceptance as this kind of scapegoat black sheep of the family. And, as Rhaenyra kind of comes into that role as heir, she fulfills that Viserys role, not only in her, proximity to the throne and what it represents as that kind of narcissistic role, but also as Viserys' heir, as his sole Targaryen child, if that's what you consider her. So with that, she kind of gives him the love and acceptance that he always wanted from Viserys in a way. But with that, children who are scapegoats, or children who have not received love in that way, oftentimes will push it away because it is uncomfortable for them. They don't know what to do with it. And I feel like we see that with him kind of then still trying to find ways to make conflict within it. Like, he can't just be happy with a happy, loving, easygoing marriage, because it's more comfortable to sit in the systems that you have existed in your whole life than to try to heal and do something new, if that makes sense. Aemond, the parentified child. We got a little bit into this when we were talking about Alicent, but I feel like Aemond kind of inhabits the next generation's role of the doer, the caretaker, the parentified child within this family unit. So he's kind of parentified from a young age. We see this again in him comforting Alicent about the eye exchange, in discussions with Aegon about doing his duty. He's very mature for his age, similar to how Alicent was. He lies for Alicent at a young age. We kind of established this. And Alicent relies on him in season 2 quite a bit, again, in the ways that a mother would usually rely on a partner as opposed to relying on a child. And we mentioned too that some of the symptoms of being this parentified child and what happens when you are a parentified child, one of those being conflict with siblings. We see this quite a bit. He has this resentment for Aegon, I think due to this kind of perceived freedom that Aegon has as a scapegoat, as the black sheep, but also I think he has conflict with him because Aegon is not doing what he's doing. He feels like Aegon is not upholding the roles and the duties. He's not studying, he's not training with the sword like he is. And we hear this in season 1 when he's kind of tracking him down with Cole, and he's like, why does he get to be heir when I'm the one who is putting in the work, So Aemond has these undue responsibilities that have been put on him from a young age. And, regardless of that, he was also pretty ruthlessly bullied. So with that, he has this pressure to keep the family together, yet Aegon is the one that he feels like gets the crown. And that is not fair to him. And we see this in his discussion with Cole. We see hints of him wanting to break out of this role. Usually they're met with negativity. I feel like an example of this could be his toast at the dinner. He's trying to kind of do something that Aegon does. He's trying to stir up some stuff and it goes very badly. And it kind of gives us this hint though that it's like Aemond is angry inside. He is bitter, not largely due to his own fault. I mean, he's been kind of put into a crappy role within an already toxic family. So, with this in mind, the parentified child often becomes the caretaker, the doer, or the enabler, all kind of the same thing. They often try to fulfill the role of this absent, sick, or disabled parent for the other parent, functioning in a way as kind of a surrogate. And we see this again in the ways that like he almost acts more like a parent to Aegon when he's tracking him down. We also see in his discussion with Helena him telling him what to do. And at the time, though, it's not just that he's fulfilling this role within his family, he also is fulfilling this role for the realm. He, at this time, is kind of, this stand-in for Father of the Realm. Once Aegon is injured, he is this, Prince Regent, so he is fulfilling the Father of the Realm role for everyone, so he has to step up into this kind of system. Helena as the lost child. The lost child is often called the dreamer or the forgotten child, which feels very fitting for her. This person often retreats into their own world, keeping out of sight, withdrawing from others in their family. We see this with Helena, quite literally, even sometimes physically covering her ears and turning her head to get away from the conflict. This person often misses out on social cues and doesn't learn common social behaviors, which kind of slates them as the weird one or the strange one, and makes it so they kind of have poor communication skills. They're often passive, obedient, and fearful of decision-making, and they stay hidden to avoid being the problem. Oftentimes they are shy, loners with difficulties with intimacy. I feel like we see this with her relationship with Alicent. She has a hard time being emotionally vulnerable and leveling with her, and same with Aegon. It's very clear they don't have a great relationship going on. With the kind of lost child, they often deny that they even have feelings at all. And I feel like we see this in her reaction to the death of her son Jaehaerys. These children often do not bother even getting upset. Instead, they just withdraw into their own reality. So again, I feel like that is all very fitting for her. So, with this in mind, I often see people say that Daemon and Aemond are two sides of the same coin, trying to say that they're like the same type of person or something. And I want to point out they're two sides of the same coin, not the same side of the same coin. I think there are key fundamental differences to them in their character. There are a lot of similarities, but these key fundamental differences is what kind of slates them into different roles. Aemond as this kind of doer, caretaker, person who's getting stuff done in the family, and Aegon and Daemon as the scapegoats that get blamed for everything. So Daemon and Aegon, they're both blamed for the issues in the family, fairly and unfairly. They're both kind of rebels due to their placement in the family system. They act out, they have inappropriate displays of emotion, etc. They both showcase loyalty to their family members. We see this with Aegon riding in on Sunfire and then being very shocked when his brother tries to kill him. And we see this too with Daemon with the Stepstone's crown and with his season 2 arc in the kind of Harrenhal House of Horrors. All of that kind of craziness was to showcase in the end that he does not want to usurp his family. He does not want to betray his family or go against them. He wants to be loyal to his family and uphold and kind of help them, which is the direct opposite of Aemond. We see the opposite where Aemond makes a decision of, no, you know what? I am going to usurp my family. I'm going to get rid of my brother who's been a thorn in my side. So again, two sides of the same coin, but those key differences in their character are important. So with that, I think, like I said, Alicent and Aemond are both slated into these similar roles within their generation's family unit, and thus they bond over these shared values of upholding these duties, upholding order and obligation in the family. They're both these doers and caretakers. And the result of that is we see Alicent obsess over Rhaenyra and her perceived traits and her perceived faults and what she thinks she is not doing to uphold the values, the duty, the honor of the family. We see the same thing with Aemond and Aegon. We see him have this anger towards Aegon and a little bit towards Daemon. With Aegon, however, it does seem he has some level of care a little bit, or at least this duty and obligation to not him. That all goes away in season 2. He finally makes a choice, which directly, again, opposes Daemon's choice. The decision being that he is willing to sacrifice loyalty and family for the crown that he perceives as his right. And I think Aemond also resents Aegon for not taking the responsibility seriously, but secretly has a little bit of envy at Aegon's perceived freedom. And I think he looks at Daemon in a similar way, but with none of the love and none of the responsibility to him. He sees Daemon and he sees all the things he hates in Aegon, but he also sees in Daemon the things that he kind of wishes and wants for himself. That ability to rebel, that ability to be the scapegoat, that ability to shirk the responsibilities and the weight of having to take care of everyone and clean up everyone's mess. So again, two sides of the same coin, but not the same side of the same coin. They are fundamentally different, and I feel like we see that with their actions toward their families. So, with all that in mind, what do these roles tell us about possible future plot points for these characters? So, with Rhaenyra, sometimes the golden child can evolve into being a covert narcissist. So, with this, and with some information we have about leaks of future seasons, with Emma Darcy kind of saying that Rhaenyra is leaning into this faith, into this kind of religiousness, into this idea that maybe the gods are smiling down on her and choosing her for things, it kind of plays perfectly into some of these traits of the covert narcissist, like a hidden grandiosity. So this inflated sense of self and self-importance, but presenting a false humility to others. So I feel like we see this with her, again, kind of trying to inhabit this inherently narcissistic role as ruler of the realm, as leader of the Targaryen family. But also we see this in the White Hart choosing her, in her being the sole carrier of Aegon's prophecy. And we might see this too if Mysaria is going to be whispering in her ear, hyping her up. We also see passive aggressive behavior, victim mentality. Not too sure about these two with her. I think you could make some arguments for it. Lack of empathy, I feel like you could argue this with her burning of the dragon seeds, the ends justify the means. Hypersensitivity to criticism, it's hard to determine if this is due to her being a woman in this position and being constantly questioned by people, or if it is due to her believing that she is the best and kind of slowly becoming more of a covert narcissist. Again, it's difficult to say. In manipulative behavior, you could again make an argument for this as well. You could say in season 1, when she says, I believe it's like, "Thank you, Father," during the scene where Alicent has the dagger, you could say that that is a bit manipulative. People make arguments for some of her behaviors being manipulative. And again, that's kind of a sign of a covert narcissist. So maybe in the future seasons, we'll see her kind of delving deeper into this path, because we do know from the books that she needs to go from the realm's delight to a character who is pretty largely disliked. It's hard to say because the book is a lot of like propaganda, what's real, what's not real, how much of the history has been rewritten by the winners, etc. So we'll just have to see, but I think that could be a path they maybe take her down. Daemon. Sometimes the black sheep or the scapegoat is able to break away from the toxic dynamic. We kind of mentioned this earlier. They're sometimes the one that gets therapy and gets help and gets away from the stress. Oftentimes they're seen as the most honest member, but honesty, especially about the nature of the toxic dynamic of the family, is not always welcomed. And the truth can be ugly and hard to hear. So they may try to kind of distance themselves, especially if they're not fully healed. Daemon has come to this realization that he wants to be loyal to his family, he wants to help, but he's clearly not fully healed from all of his traumas and things that have happened. And so I think if he sees Rhaenyra going down this darker path, and maybe he tries to communicate this to her and she does not listen, especially if his daughter Rhaena is going to be fulfilling the Nettles role, maybe he will kind of make the choice to go off with her instead, as opposed to staying within the toxicity, if that makes sense. Now with Alicent, as we previously stated, sometimes excessive caretaking in this way can lead to the person becoming a martyr as opposed to like the caretaker. And so Alicent's excessive self-sacrifice could lead to, a fear of abandonment, loneliness, inability to trust others, and resentment, kind of going further down this martyr path. I feel like this makes sense for what we know about her in the books, having this aversion to the color green, not trusting anyone or anything. So with Aemond, I think his parentified role and kind of what we already talked about with his relationship with the brothel worker, of him kind of hating this pressure that he's under, I feel like it could kind of shape his future interactions and relationships with Alice Rivers. Maybe he's gonna see all this trouble that everyone's in and he's gonna say, screw this, I'm tired of picking up everyone's mess. Instead, I want to be with this person who is able to kind of fulfill this mother caretaker role that I never had, but also treats me well. You know, we know Alice in the books is a wet nurse and she's much older than him. And she likely, yeah, will not be having these expectations of him that his mother does. So could shape the way their relationship unfolds. And with Aegon, where we leave him off, he quite literally is fleeing. He is the fleeing scapegoat. We might see him kind of having some brief moments of enjoying his freedom, but ultimately he will either be caught or probably brought back into the fold. He's relying on Larys's promise of approval from others, being the realm's delight, that, you know, he really wants that. But unhealed scapegoats can often find themselves falling into depression, drugs, alcohol, and this can lead to death. So if he gets brought back into the fray, back into this toxic family cycle, it could be very bad for him. And with Helena, I feel like it's just going to be more of this forgotten child struggle. There's a thing that forgotten children often struggle with, which is called omnipotent guilt. And what this means is it's this idea of feeling responsible and having self-blame for the issues that arise from this kind of unconscious idea that you have a godlike power to know and control the outcomes of things. And Helena quite literally is having visions that she cannot control or change. So I feel like that fits with her very well. I feel like her having these visions, knowing she can't change them, will kind of still contribute to her sense of depression, loneliness, self-guilt as she isolates. And then with Daemon, we have not met Daemon yet, so it's difficult to say what role he fulfills in all of this. But with what we've heard a little bit about in the show, about him being, you know, a good lad, being, you know, kind, and kind of this good representation of the kind of Hightower, Targ, you know, part of the family, I think he might fulfill the role of the mascot or maybe the hero. And so the mascot is the person that kind of makes everyone look good in the family. They often use humor as a coping mechanism, and they do this to keep others happy. Similarly, the hero is the child that makes everyone look good and kind of upkeeps the appearance that everything is all right. And from what we hear about him being this representative in Old Town, it seems like he's probably fulfilling that role. And from what we know in the books of him being dubbed like Daemon the Daring and being spoken about pretty positively, I would not be surprised if he fulfills that like heroic or mascot role for the rest of them. So, with all that in mind, will any of this be relevant to the show? Maybe. I think it is just, again, interesting to kind of delve into these characters a little bit more, to try to kind of figure them out, to understand them better, and then to determine why they do the things they do. Maybe it gives you a little bit more sympathy for them. And also it kind of can, like I said, give us this guesstimate as to where their characters might go in future plot points in the show. But anyways, with all of this, I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please feel free to like and maybe subscribe so I can continue to make content like this. And if there's any specific video topics you want me to talk about in the future, feel free to let me know. Okay, great. Thanks. Bye.